it'll be like, this meeting has a password.
I don't have that. I'm just in with participants.
Oh, yeah, me too.
Good. Oh, I see Leonard in there. Leonard, are you there?
Joe, I'm gonna hang up the phone.
Yep, me too. Hey, Leonard, are you there? Oh, might be on mute.
All right, looks like I have sound now.
Hey, Leonard, how are you?
All right, just trying to force myself to be productive.
No problem.
So we are recording. Let me see here. You can share all participants. All right, so I should be able to kick it to your side whenever necessary.
Okay.
Just close the door a little bit. Let me just make sure everyone has the right account. I need to respond to this quick email. Sorry, do I need to share screen with you, sir?
With me, no, or here, I didn't start my video, but I'm here.
All right.
Yeah, and I can do. I've got some basic visuals and stuff like that, so I can do a share screen. Let me see. How do I physically do that? Do you need to give me permission for me to share a screen? That's what I'm not sure on.
I think you should have an option on your window that says share screen.
Let me see. I'm not seeing it.
Joe, there's on my screen in the bottom middle. Hi, Leonard. This is Eli, by the way.
Oh yeah, I see it.
Great.
Okay,
And,
yeah, I've got it. Let me see.
As far as recording permissions, are we still doing that, Joe? The plan is to record, hopefully, for.
Oh yeah, absolutely, Leonard. Would you mind granting Eli recording permission? I think if you want to walk him through that, and if you can record it, that would be awesome.
Yes. So if you go on the bottom, there's a participants button, and that brings up all of us. And then in the somewhere next to the name, it should be. Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
Share screen working? Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, I'll stop the share so we know it works.
Of course, we might have to trim the first 5 minutes of us just chatting about.
Yeah, exactly. That is fine.
Yeah, I think some of the uniformed folks are just trying to get away from COVID stuff for a quick minute as well. Got a couple emails late last night of, hey, what's the login information?
Oh, nice. Good. Yeah, yeah, right. A different topic. Nice to have it right at a moment like now.
And we got one Yeah, the funny thing is, I've been still managing to wake up at 5:40 in the morning to show up in the office. The 2 days I have to show up here for. So you managed to find your old slides?
I did actually. Yeah, it's this one. They're pretty straightforward. There are some visuals. If we're gonna have any firefighters, I feel like I should have more sexy firefighting photos. I don't have enough, but it's basically just sort of like, it's more like lecture notes kind of things,
Okay.
overview stuff. So it's not super integral, but potentially helpful if if people are looking at that sort of stuff.
Let me just find a good background then.
One second. Should I get some more water?
Hey, Matt, can you hear me?
Right. All right, back at it.
So Joe, we have Matt Hines Aldrich on here. He's the one that recommended your book to me originally.
Oh, great. Thanks so much, Matt.
Yeah, sure. Look forward to it.
Yes. How did you come across it?
Good question. I was gonna say when it first came out, I was working for the Atlanta Fire Rescue, and I don't remember if to be honest, I don't have any idea how I came across it at the point, and read it, and it was kind of like, it was kind of an epiphany, like finally someone, like, yeah, data is hugely important, but can also be hugely damaging and harmful and misapplied, and I was like, finally someone gets it, and yeah, so I shared it widely. In fact, actually, I don't know if you saw, I actually just shared it yet again recently in an article about fire risk prediction and the good, the bad, and the ugly, and
Oh, cool.
Kind of, and said like, hey, you really need to put it in or publish it in the Medium, and like, and if you really want to know about this, check out this book. Kind of.
Oh, wow. I'll have to check it out. Where does the article live?
It's in Medium.
Oh, it's a Medium. Oh, okay, great.
Yeah, it's called Pre-Fire. It's takeoff of the old Pre-Crime from the what's it called? Whatever that movie, or the book originally in the movie. But
yeah, the Minority Report, right?
yeah, that'd be the one.
No, exactly. Which I've not seen in ages. I'm watching everything these days because I, don't. As we all are. Yeah, exactly. Maybe it's time for a little Tom Cruise sci-fi. Can't go wrong.
Exactly. Well, I'm going to be on mute because my my canine executive assistants are a little bit loud in the office.
Oh yeah. No problem. Thanks again. So nice to meet you.
I also have, looks like the folks from Center for Public Safety Excellence, CPSE, some of her folks, they're the agency accreditation group. Based in
Oh, great.
And
Nice to meet y'all.
that software company, they're big into analytics. Some folks, looks like Frank Blackley from North Carolina, just looking at all these folks that are logging in. So I've been, and have Daniel Lejeune, he's the grad student advisor for my student team. I'm still waiting for the rest of that team. We'll start in like 2 to 3 minutes.
Great. What people more people signing in every moment. We kind of are at peak webinar right now. Like this is kind of like we're at that moment in cultural history. This is like
And I'm going to mute myself until we'll start.
Cool. Matt, I know you're on mute, but nice job with the Tiger King background. I saw that one yesterday in a business conference. I was very impressed.
Exactly. It was one. It was one of those. Yeah. I figure Leonard wants to be on a fire ground. I want to be on Tiger King, apparently.
And any reuse of the extra $5 school photo background laser light show that my parents never sprung for, to my annual disappointment, is certainly a favorite.
That was my conversation with my younger sister about how, yeah, finally I get the laser background I always wanted. So it sounds like I'm not the only one.
Hey, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Let's start at 11:03, so another 2 minutes or so.
Great.
I know a lot of folks take a little bit time to just to dial the numbers once they're logging in. Just addressing my student team from Rice, a lot of the folks you see on the webinar here is fire chiefs and fire administrators across the country, not just Texas, along with some software folks and some parent organizations for professional associations. The guest speaker is Joe Flood. He is the writer of The Fires, describing what happened in pretty much New York City in the 70s and 80s when they just focused a lot on statistics and how it could backfire. So I'll let Joe go ahead. I'll mute myself. I can monitor the chat window just if anyone has questions as well. But everyone can unmute themselves as necessary.
Thanks, Leonard. And yeah, absolutely. As people are, feel free to ask questions as we go. Whether the chat window or shout something at me. I think the whole, I have some base stuff I'd like to certainly get to, but getting a sense of where everyone's coming from and what kind of things are helpful and interesting and relevant in your sort of day-to-day life will be a big factor. So yeah, thanks everybody for logging in and joining. As Leonard said, so I'm a reporter. I wrote the book the fires here. 2010, I believe, is when it came out. I am not, or well, actually, I was going to say I usually start these things by saying I'm not a firefighter. I am technically a member of the Sharps Corner, South Dakota Volunteer Fire Department, and did fight a wildlands fire 4 days ago. So I guess I can sort of claim to be a firefighter for the minute anyway. Very different from urban environments. Grass fires tend to be a little bit different situation, a little less intense. We're going to talk about a very much an urban situation here today, which is New York City in the 1970s. I'm actually going to do. I have a bit of, they're more like lecture notes. There's not that many visuals, but I'm going to do a share screen here this is kind of I kind of pulled together quickly some stuff from a presentation I did at FDIC years back. And is that working? Is the share screen going through now?
Yes, sir. Great.
Okay, perfect. Good. So you can see what I can see in the PowerPoint. This book really started, there's a line like the history of science. There's a line that, I'm sure I'm stealing it from some book that I'm forgetting the name of, but that, the history of science is not written with eureka, aha moments. It's written by moments of saying, that's kind of weird. That sort of strange things that don't conform to what you'd expect or to the model or the viewpoint are really what drives innovation and change and learning and discovery. And, for me, the book came about with an observation of something that was strange, which was I was working on an article for a magazine and sort of randomly was talking to people in this neighborhood, Alphabet City, Lower East Side, East Village, in Lower Manhattan. And talk about the 1970s, which was sort of a crazy period in the city's history. With kind of there was a riot during a blackout, and there was mass unemployment and increases in drugs and crime and things like that, and sort of social dysfunction. And people were talking about. I was asking people about it who'd lived in the neighborhood in those days. They said, "Oh, you mean back when the neighborhood burned down?" And I'm not from New York, from the suburbs of Boston. I said, neighborhood burned down? What are you talking about? I said, oh yeah, like walk around it. If you walk around in this city, particularly in this neighborhood, if you see a building that is less than 100 years old, it is almost certainly standing on top of what was a vacant lot that had been an old tenement building that burned down and fell apart. I thought, that is strange. And I started running some numbers, and as it turned out, it was correct. A census district that takes up half of the area of Alphabet City, which is sort of, like a 3-4 blocks wide by, 15 by 20 block north-south area, lost 65% of its housing stock between 1970 and 1980. I mean, 2/3 of all buildings went uninhabited during this period. Excuse me, 65% of the population disappeared, 35% of the housing stock, because a lot of buildings went half vacant, but not entirely. This was very strange to me, and I started running numbers, and it turned out that this was true all over the city. The South Bronx was the area that got hit the worst. I'll return to this first slide in a second. A couple of quick quotes for us here. So this is resident Luis Lugo in the South Bronx, Crotona Park, talking about in the 1960s, saying there was a neighborhood that there'd been so much life, so many people, so many stores, everything was busy, busy, busy. A really thriving stepping stone immigrant neighborhood that was, pretty fully functional. And then we have here from a New York City Board of Education surveyor in 1970 talking about this neighborhood as saying, this entire area is high density housing that is in fair condition. By the early mid 1970s, that neighborhood had turned into what became Fort Apache, the Bronx, the 41st, I believe it's the 41st precinct, became the sort of famously one of the most dangerous police precincts in the country. The Paul Newman movie gets made of it. Just a few years after that, the guys used to joke that it wasn't Fort Apache anymore. It was Little House on the Prairie because there was no one around. And scenes like this were a little more typical, where there are neighborhoods that saw like 80, 90% loss of housing stock and population in a 10-year period. What made it more interesting to me anyway is that these are not areas like, you know, parts of Buffalo or something like that that went abandoned and bankrupt and all that and never came back. The area actually came back quite nicely starting in the 1980s, and to this day it is now once again thriving immigrant neighborhood. So I was left this question, like, what happened in the 1970s? You know, what would cause the richest, most desirable you know, city in the world to have massive fire problems that burned hundreds of thousands of people out of their homes, mass, you know, displacement and abandonment and loss of housing stock and things like that. And so there's a lot of variables, but this picture here tells the story of a lot of it. This company will no longer protect you against fires and emergencies. This was one of dozens of fire companies that were shuttered in New York City throughout this period, in the midst of a very serious fire problem that really became a firestorm. And as those of you in you know, fire services know, there is a huge difference between a fire that is gotten to in, you know, say 6 minutes and one that's gotten to in 12 minutes. It might be the difference between a room catching on fire and now a whole apartment burns out. It might be the difference between an apartment that burns and an entire floor of a building that burns. And when you, and that might be the difference between a building that recovers and where people, you know, where that is renovated and people live in, and one that goes completely abandoned. And this really was a big part of what happened in New York City in the 1970s, was that they closed dozens of fire stations and really turned a fire problem into a firestorm. That was really one of the most destructive things that happened in this place in the era. So why are they closing fire companies at a time of increased fire incidents? Strange question. I'm going to get into that a little bit. As it turns out, a lot of it had to do with statistics. You used to see in the slide, I have the term big data. I think I wrote this thing in 2014 or 15 when big data was a big term. The term is a little out of vogue, but the same basic concept applies. And this is really a story about how new statistical modeling, a real sort of, it's kind of utopian belief, techno-optimism, as people sometimes call it, ended up really fueling a series of innovative approaches and techniques, but as it turned out, really bad implementation and analysis that really became a huge problem. So just to quickly think about this idea, this concept of, you know, data and big data. So the word data is it's a Latin word. It comes from datum, meaning the thing given. And so, you know, essentially data, the word itself is this idea of counting the thing given, counting reality to better understand it and to move forward with it. And, you know, it's just some quick examples here on the screen. You know, I've got 4 pictures here. You know, what you can count, what is sort of, you know, the largest data set you can work with changes over time. Up top left, we have clay tablets. I think these are from Mesopotamia. And this is really, you know, actually one of the interesting things about numbers and tracking and things like that. We actually wrote numbers down before we wrote words down. The original sort of, you know, collection system was not, you know, whoever came after Homer writing down his stories. It was bureaucrats in, you know, early in the Fertile Crescent marking down how many heads of wheat or excuse me, acres of wheat, or, you know, whatever the hectares, whatever they used back then, and heads of sheep and things like that, tracking for government bureaucratic purposes. Can we tax people? How much wealth is there? How many people live in this area? How many can we conscribe to go to war against, you know, a neighboring enemy civilization? You know, sort of moving along, then we have, next to that, we have this is one of the earliest double ledger accounting books that still exists. You know, the Dutch were sort of big on this. And of course, you know, eventually found in New York City. We have a very large slide rule at the lower left. And over on the right, a sort of dark photo, but it's John von Neumann and one of the first digital computers. that was actually sort of really built to do calculations to build the nuclear and eventually hydrogen bombs. And so this idea of, so we'd like to think of ourselves as being in sort of constantly new revolutionary eras where algorithms and data and now artificial intelligence are sort of the buzzwords. And certainly each new era has different things, and artificial intelligence in particular is a little different, but each era has had its own revolutionary accounting and statistical methods that have had huge impacts on the world, for good and for bad. So, talking about the era that we're talking about here, we're looking at the data side of this. The people we're going to look at is the RAND Corporation, which is sort of America's original military think tank. Really kind of the first original sort of modern think tank in a lot of ways. It grew out of World War II. It was founded in Santa Monica in California, initially very technical, designing rockets and things like that, but moved into math and computer programming and engineering and modeling systems, algorithms we call them now. And in particular, so quickly, some things that might resonate a bit. The RAND Corporation actually has more Nobel Prizes than any institution in the world, or the people that work for it, more than any university, more than any group. They became, if anyone's seen Dr. Strangelove, if you remember the old sort of World War II, kind of the lunacy of nuclear policy, well, most of the people that Dr. Strangelove was based on worked for the RAND Corporation. You think of the movie A Beautiful Mind, John Nash, and game theory, and this idea of using, mathematics to predict human behavior, and how people would strategize against one another. Nash was a RAND Corporation employee and fellow. I mean, a lot of these, it really was a place where a lot of the most innovative and cutting edge work in the sort of post-World War II era in America was coming out of. And it's you wouldn't necessarily think of this as being a key part of a fire department in the late 1960s, early 1970s, but it was, and we can get into that a little bit as well, and the fire department in New York, and really a lot of that was happening there. I also want to talk just briefly about a sort of a conceptual sort of framework of how statistics and data and sort of central planning can be done. There's an economist here by the name of Charles Lindblom, and he had this really fascinating framework for breaking down sort of planning, decision-making approaches, what he called the root approach versus the branch approach, kind of using a tree ecological model here. So the root approach is what we typically see from large organizations and from, particularly government planning. You might think of, certainly the way that sort of Obamacare was rolled out, massive government sort of change, where basically they took a situation, healthcare coverage in America. They took a bunch of the leading minds, from academics and thinkers and insurance industry people and lobbyists and congressional people, and they came up with a centralized, top-down approach to it. Now there were elements that were decentralized and things like that, but a lot of the planning was central, and they charged forward with this plan. This is certainly how cities get planned for the most part. You come up with we're going to put the highway here and the public transportation here, and we'll zone this district for one thing, and we'll zone this other district for another thing. That's kind of the centralized route approach. Lindblom talked about the other, which is the branch approach. In England, they might call it the science of muddling through. So you're talking about a situation where there's not a ton of extensive pre-planning. Instead of like a single carefully planned centralized initiative, it's a lot of incremental attempts at doing things. You think about the way that branches grow on a tree. I mean, you've probably seen this where a tree is sort of asymmetrical and lopsided. It would probably try to grow in a sort of symmetrical fashion, but maybe the light was blocked on one side because of a building or because of another large tree. And so the tree actually grew in another direction where that light was. It was adaptive. It was reactive. It was able to change its course. And this is actually the way that cities where it might have been built were originally built in many cases. No one came along and said, you know what, we're going to build a massive city that will become the financial center of the world in some uninhabited island, or certainly was inhabited by the Lenape people initially, but this island in the New World. You know, no one planned this. A city like New York, like anywhere, grew in fits and starts. You know, people found different industries and ways to make money, and in the case of New York, it's certainly trade. And they bit by bit built a city, built an economy, built infrastructure around it. And I think that these two different kinds of approaches, a sort of like extensive pre-planning, charge forward no matter what, versus a more lightweight, adaptive, reactive system, is really important to what happened here. And it's maybe a framework to think about as you think about your own you know, statistical work you're doing or working in city government, fire services. And all of this results in, here's some slides from the actual studies themselves that were put together by the RAND Corporation. The original predicting, you know, fire company average response travel times, which is really the key factor here. So how does this come about? You know, 50 years ago, a really early time for this sort of thing. New York City at the time was the mayor at the time in the late 1960s, early 1970s was a guy named John Lindsay. John Lindsay was sort of the Republican JFK. He was a liberal Republican in the sort of Nelson Rockefeller mold, which is sort of an in vogue thing back then, the fiscally conservative, socially liberal creature that people seem to love on the East Coast and don't really exist in politics in a lot of other places. And Lindsay was really big on innovation and sort of like disruptive technologies. He idolized Robert McNamara, who at the time was who ran the Pentagon under JFK and then under Lyndon Johnson. Like Rand itself, McNamara came out of World War II. He was a statistical analyst who had done mapped bombing runs to figure out the most efficient ways to bomb Germany and Japan, and most efficient ways to move, you know, men and machines and equipment around the world, and to really make incredibly difficult decisions using this new idea of crunching numbers, because you had these early, you know, sort of data crunching technology that you could suddenly use on this mass scale. It was incredibly useful and a really sort of under-heralded aspect of why the Allies won World War II. And, you know, over the years, McNamara at first, he goes to the Ford Motor Company. And so he goes from government doing these sorts of things in the military into the private sector. And the best in the Whiz Kids was this group that he was involved with that went to Ford and really took over Ford and eventually the entire American automotive industry, like many other industries, filling these places with, you know, kind of statistically minded, you know, people, number crunchers. You know, McNamara famously had that sort of brill-creamed hair and the thick glasses and always had a calculator on his desk. You have a new sort of person running American business, and then McNamara moves over to the Pentagon, and this is brought back to government. And this is very trendy. And New York City wants to be at the forefront of this, to bring these sort of innovative techniques to the fore. And it had a fire chief and later fire commissioner, John O'Hagan, who's really at the forefront. O'Hagan is in many ways the sort of first and most innovative fire chief on a lot of different fronts. He literally writes the high-rise building codes that eventually, for New York City, the first of their kind that become standard around the country. He is, the slippery water was this thing that a lot of you might remember and know about, polymers introduced into water to make it faster to flow out a hose, to cut friction rates, to increase the amount of water being pumped onto a fire. The jaws of life actually came about as part because of an experimental program he had for building and eventually car cutting devices to extract people from situations. Really, really innovative. And he saw the RAND Corporation, which was hired by New York City, as a real opportunity to do these things. And he wanted to think about how they could be used to innovate the fire department and sort of make his, make his reputation, improve fire services. And the area they focus on is response times. Firefighting has a lot of difficult areas to quantify that are experiential. One thing that can be quantified is response time. How long does it physically take for fire trucks and engines to get to where a fire is happening? But response time, as many of you know, is sort of a limited variable, a limited measuring system. And you can measure it in a lot of different ways. So in the case of these first attempts to sort of model response time, one thing they're looking at is first due. In other words, the first company to arrive, as it turns out, theoretically arrive, we'll get into that, at the fire, not a full complement, which is a lot of you know is a complicated thing. You know, if you're talking about a major structural fire, you know, if an engine company shows up first, they might not be able to do much right away because they have no access. They have no way to get the water on the fire. You might need you need truckies. You need a ladder company to show up to bust open windows, cut holes in the roof, and things like that to really get a lot of water on the fire. Of course, that can go the opposite way too. You might have a ladder company showing up first, and what you really need is an engine, you know, pumper on site. And so, you know, just measuring the first due is you know, can be a shortcoming variable. Another thing that they did, that came in was they were thinking about how quickly you get to the box. You know, of course, back then, no one had cell phones. Mostly companies were responding to people pulling those old emergency boxes, you know, on the telephone pole, which was its own thing. And then here's the key one when we're talking about response time: theoretical response times. These days, it's different. You know, we're using actual CAD or GPS or status button times. Back then, it was actually theoretical response time, and this became a really key factor in the mistakes that they made that eventually resulted in closing the most busiest fire companies, not just in the city, but in the country, and causing all these problems. So, how do you get theoretical response time data? Well, the way you do it is you sample a little bit. So what they did was literally give stopwatches to fire companies and told officers to, when the bell rang, start the stopwatch. When they got to the firebox, stop the stopwatch, write the numbers down. Decent way of measuring things. The problem was the data ended up being pretty terrible. You know, this is a brand new thing to a lot of people, and it's pretty cumbersome. The alarm goes off. You're worried about getting your gear together, getting on the truck or the engine, getting out the door. And in addition to that, you've got to find this stopwatch. You've got to turn it on. You got to make sure it's running. Then you get to the fire, and now you've got to like stop the stopwatch and write down the time when you've got a million other things to do. So they got a lot of bad data. Sometimes it's just because people weren't doing a good job of tracking. Other times people they cut the data and made the times faster to look like, hey, we're the fastest company around. Other times they made the data longer response times to say, hey, we're overburdened. We need another fire company in this neighborhood. Anyway, they got a lot of bad data that came out of that, which, as anybody knows, when we're talking about statistical modeling, you know, garbage in, garbage out, right? How good your data is the key thing. Not to bring up the coronavirus right now, but you know, a lot of things we're talking about. There's been a huge change, moment to moment, week to week, day to day, in terms of how we are planning things. Should people wear masks? When can you reopen? It seems like there's a huge amount of shifting from people are saying one thing and then it changes. The biggest reason is we have very limited sample sizes. We don't know yet a lot of things about the disease and about how it spreads and things like that. And so you're making decisions based on really limited data, limited samples and surveys. And as a result, your analysis is not going to be very accurate with a flawed or limited data set. And this really plays out here. This sort of flawed assumptions is a big thing. So after they get this assemblage of data and some response times, they start crunching the numbers to figure out average response times. And they make a few strange assumptions based on the data. One is that they assume that every fire company in the city was available to respond from their house to a fire. This is often true. But we're talking about a period in New York City where companies are dealing with 5,000 workers in a year, not 5,000 runs, 5,000 working fires. And in fact, in most cases, probably many more, because they were putting out fires so fast, they weren't bothering to do the paperwork and to track it. And you just crunch those, think about that for a second. 5,000 fires a year for a single company, that's almost 20 fires a day that the companies are going on. Many companies in busy neighborhoods like the South Bronx, which were poor, very high density population, a lot of industrial, a lot of old infrastructure, companies are just going from fire to fire to fire. They're never responding from their house. And so that assumption is flawed. All these other variables that I just mentioned, population density, building type, traffic hazards, other variables, they didn't factor it in at all. They thought that these were not going to significantly impact response times. When you think about what processing power was in 1968, makes sense. Pong was still like a dozen years away from being invented. They couldn't crunch that many numbers. You couldn't weight a lot of variables all at once. So it's understandable, but think about this for a second. Can you imagine for a second planning out response times, estimating response times, and thinking that there will be no difference in response times in Midtown Manhattan at 4 in the afternoon versus some part of Staten Island or the Bronx, much more northern Bronx, sparsely settled suburban at 4 in the morning. Traffic, it matters hugely in fire response, as I'm sure you all know. What this all added up to was that it really gave short shrift to neighborhoods where you had a lot of fire companies where they were needed. And I'll explain why for a second. Think about this one for a second, okay? A lot of times you will see in fire company, you'll see multiple fire companies in a single building, in a single house. And I think the reasons are pretty obvious. One is shared infrastructure, and two is the neighborhood has a lot of fires. You need a lot of companies right there to be able to respond, because you might have a fire come in and one company's already out fighting it. And so you need a backup company in that same house to go fight this next fire. If you have a statistical model that assumes that companies can always respond from their house, a second company in that same house is of literally no use whatsoever, according to the model. You would never have a situation where the second company needed to respond. So the model is saying that a second company in a firehouse is of no use. We all know this to not be true. At this time in New York City, the busiest fire company in the world was Engine Company 81, a famous book written about it. And the second busiest company the third busiest company in the city and in the world was in the same building. Obviously, the third busiest fire company in the world is extremely useful. But the models that they built made it look like this company wasn't useful at all. And in retrospect, this seems obvious to all of us. In the same way that a lot of statistical assumptions, like the mistakes that are made when you use these modeling systems are always obvious in retrospect. They become apparent. What they're not obvious in is in the moment. When you have modeling systems that are built where often kind of a black box, you don't necessarily know how the equations work all that well. And there aren't that many people with the skills and the tools to sort of engage with them and to figure out how they are going to be, how they're used and what might be the mistakes being made in these models. And so as a result, all these mistakes are made and they charge forward with it. There's this old line that if you only have a hammer, all you see is nails. And this became a real problem for the department, as I imagine a lot of you see. If you can't measure it, you don't value it. And that is a big thing in business and in government. And as the fire department really became super focused in New York City on response times alone, they started ignoring a lot of other really important areas. So to make sure that so all non-response duties like building inspections for fire hazards, hydrant tests, stuff like that, were completely slashed. There was only one variable they were keying in on: response time. You slash building inspections or hydrant tests, doesn't hurt your response time. Great, no problem. Of course, that's crazy, right? If you're not testing hydrants, some of them don't work. If you're not looking out for fire hazards, they're going to result in fires. Fire marshals were slashed. Logistical units, communications, air tank refills, all these sorts of things, also completely slashed. Equipment budgets in the garage they used to call, there was the fire departments in New York, they're in Queens, where their main garage mechanic shop was. They used to call it Red Square, because there were so many idle pieces of apparatus sitting there in this massive parking lot not being used because it was such a backlog. And so all these problems that come up as a result of all these things, because of this planning that just weren't foreseen and really had these sort of ugly consequences. I've been rambling here for a few minutes. I want to make sure, I know we've got probably like 15 minutes left or something like that. This is sort of maybe taking a little time to get it to the foreground, but I wanted to really talk about what the sort of situation was and how these things are coming in. Leonard, I don't know if you have any questions or if there's anybody out there that wants to, cut me off here for a second and ask any questions. I want to make sure I'm, hitting things that are useful to people.
I have no one posting questions yet directly to me, but anyone that's willing can speak out.
Okay, great. So, I think that, one thing I'll talk about just to think about where this, and I think you can I'll skip ahead a little bit. And I think you can imagine where you can see the writing on the wall here. Essentially, you have a statistical system that is interesting and new and innovative, but not well understood. It is not great at quantifying all of the variables that are so important to a complicated thing like firefighting. And it puts very little or no value on whatever it cannot measure. And so as a result, it results in a really incredible period. I mean, it's talked about where you have entire neighborhoods are burning down and going vacant. Teachers in the South Bronx in the 1970s would talk about how their classrooms always smelled like smoke because kids were, there were so many fires in neighborhoods that kids' clothes smelled like smoke. And a lot of times they were bouncing from house to house to house, didn't even have time or the money to wash clothes. And so they might have literally fled in the middle of the night from a fire, smelled like fire, moved in with some cousins, and didn't even have a chance to wash clothes, and the kids smell like smoke coming into the class. You have teachers talking about like teaching in a refugee zone because kids were in and out of schools so much that they just couldn't keep track of them. It was they were moved about like a war zone. All these crazy things that happen and had these huge impacts. So let's talk, I just want to talk a little bit about like, how does this happen? We're getting a little wonky and a little bureaucratic, but how is so many bad decisions unleashed in this city? And I want to talk about like sort of the life cycle of statistical analysis and how it's run through companies and organizations. Like I said, we all imagine that what we are doing now, like we invented everything, right? That like AI is the first time we've thought about how to really bring data problem solving to government and businesses. And of course, people have been using different data solutions for hundreds of years. And so as a result of this history, you have a bit of a life cycle that you can plan and predict and look at. And I just want to like run through how this works in New York and think about how this might apply to your own communities, your own fire departments, and how how these sort of statistical methods are used. So we have what I call a stage one fear of a math planet, a little Public Enemy record shout out there for anybody who remembers from that era. This is sort of an era. So you think about a company or an industry that is anecdotal, intuitive, right? Where decisions are based on stories and experience and instinct. These are often resistant to bringing in statistical methods of decision making. So you have old timers, and they are not looking to change a whole lot or bring in a bunch of mathematicians and people like that. But bit by bit, these things happen. As I talked about here, World War II brings statistical planning really to the fore in a lot of ways, and so it starts getting introduced into different industries. And I mentioned there's a guy, Michael Lewis, who wrote the book Moneyball in the early 2000s, talking about how statistics were brought to the world of baseball, not by managers and coaches and owners, but by fantasy baseball players who realized, wait, the statistics, I'm better at predicting player performance than general managers are because I'm using better statistics. All these things sort of change. In the case of New York City, there's this anecdote that the Rand Corporation analysts tell about how in 1968, they had a meeting with fire chiefs, and they said, hey, we're trying to understand response times and where do you allocate resources? How do you know where to put one fire company and versus another one and all these things? And a fire chief, one of the assistant chiefs, I think, speaks up and he says, oh, it's easy. You just got to make sure they're 100 feet from the curb so they got room to turn around and get into the garage. And that maybe sort of, spoke to the attitude at the time. The idea of statistically planning, fire company allocation and things like that was new, and there was a lot of resistance to it. And so to do that, you need an integration partner. You need somebody who is from the institution who probably represents and has power and sway with the old organization and structure, who is forward thinking, who is interested in these new statistical modeling and things like that, who is going to give their ear to the quants, to the statistical planners. In the case of the whiz kids and the World War II statistical planning, it was a guy by the name of Robert Lovett in the War Department, who himself was a businessman and so understood railroads in particular. And so he understood the importance of timing and planning and stats. He brought in a guy named Tex Thornton, who built this team that, Robert McNamara became a part of, that was hugely important in World War II. In the case of baseball, it was Billy Beane, former player, and Sandy Alderson, who was the GM of the Oakland Athletics and who had been a Marine, came from a different background, really being open to the idea of hiring statistical people who, namely Theo Epstein, who became the general manager of the Red Sox and won the World Series there, and then with Chicago, and Paul DePodesta, hiring, the nerds, for lack of a better phrase, to do these sorts of things. In the case of the Fire Department of New York, it was John O'Hagan, the chief at the time. Now, you're going to move to this next stage is like the low-hanging fruit stage. And this is where statistical planning really makes its hay. Whenever you have an industry or a field that has mostly worked on these intuitive, experiential, sort of story-based decision-making and planning, when you first bring in statistics, there's incredible opportunities to be had that no one's really seen. Low-hanging fruit. In the 1960s, during World War II, until these whiz kids come along, no one's really looking at the effectiveness of different bombing runs and different methods and the most efficient and effective ways to sort of deliver the payloads. The Ford Falcon is a famous car from the 1960s, that was rooted in a statistical realization that people who had more money were buying smaller cars. Not the trend of the 1960s. What's going on here? So they built a small, light, efficient car. The Ford Falcon was incredibly successful. Baseballs on base percentage. All these different things, and in that come about. In New York, it was false alarms. It's a long tangent conversation, but Rand Corporation, working for the fire department, has some interesting insights, and they figure out some things. So as this happens, when you have some success with these statistical modeling, there's executive ascent. The quants are successful. They get more power. They move up the ranks. They hire more people from the realm, and they have more impact and authority. Now, initially, a statistical model has to sort of vie with other methods in the sort of marketplace of ideas. You have to make the case on the stats compared to other ways of evaluating things. I had a friend of mine who worked on a political campaign. It was the Obama campaign, which had a big statistical modeling team. He said when he would go, they'd have these insights. They would go to the old campaign manager types, David Axelrod, and say, hey, we should be targeting ad budgets here because of this. And whenever one of the old heads would hear that, and they would say, this doesn't make sense to me, so I'm not spending money on it. Maybe your stats are right, but you're not telling the story to me. You're not explaining why this is right. And they would get the mathematicians get frustrated. They go back to the drawing board and, be like, oh, these old guys, they don't get it. And then they would say, usually they were missing something. It turned out that they were wrong. There was some detail they were missing so that in that sort of creative friction between the old approach and the new approach, you come to a better idea. That's a scientific method, right? Thesis and test and synthesis and all these sorts of things. Now, and that's a great stage. Statistics are one of many ways to view complicated decision-making. The problem is that statistics are sort of scalable. You can use them theoretically across a whole industry, and you can use them broadly. And so you get to a situation sometimes where you have overconfidence in the models, where you put too many eggs in this one basket, and it falls prey to a lot of problems. I have a whole bunch of examples here. McNamara, we talked about running the Pentagon, famously ran it during the Vietnam War. Their whole premise of that war was they were using all these statistical models to look at, body counts, how many of the enemy were being killed versus how many American soldiers were being killed, and they had these models saying, well, we'll win the war. But it turned out to be the body count, the numbers were faked. And the assumptions of it weren't very good, and it became a really misleading measurement. The Hello Nurse was a thing in England in the 1990s. They found that there were huge wait times in the National Health Services between people showed up when they were first seen by a medical provider. So a lot of savvy hospitals invented the Hello Nurse. The Hello Nurse does not do any actual medical work whatsoever. The Hello Nurse stands at the front desk and says hello to people coming in. And now, technically, that patient has seen a medical professional. You can say that after 1 minute, this person saw a medical professional. They are not waiting anymore. So the statistics look like, hey, wait times came way down. But in reality, that's Hello Nurse is, instead of actually seeing patients in a useful way, is giving them no medical advice whatsoever. They're saying hello. It's a trick to juke the stats. The emphasis becomes on appeasing the stats, getting the right metrics, and not doing the thing that's what the statistics are supposed to be doing, which is improving actual service. You know, at a certain point, people forget that statistics are a heuristic. They're stand-in. They're a symbol of the core thing that you're going for. And they're an imperfect stand-in in many cases. And so, you know, this really becomes what happens in New York. And I give the example of like the stopwatches. You get bad response time data. You know, that right there, you're going to have all these problems. And if you implement on bad data, if you implement on bad ideas, you're going to have all sorts of issues. You know, I talked about this, you know, some average response times. I know this is a huge issue, you know, with a lot of folks, response time stuff. Just some quick things, a little wonky here, but you know, average, right? There's multiple definitions of average: mean, median, mode. The mean, the usual we use for average, that's the average time between all these companies. So if you have 100 fire runs and it averages out to, let's say, a 6-minute response. Well, if you have if half your response times are 5 minutes and 30 seconds and half are 6 minutes and 30 seconds, that you have an average of 6 minutes, right? That's a pretty tight average. That is a small standard deviation, a small Gini coefficient in the math speak. There's not a lot of spread between the instances, and that 6-minute average is pretty reflective. You know, all your fires are within 30 seconds of that. But what if you get to a 6-minute response average with half of your responses being in 3 minutes and half of them being in 9 minutes? That is a much larger standard deviation. That is a very, so in that case, you can have a very different set of data and still have the same mean. So thinking about how you average these sorts of things is important. Are you trying to have the best average response time, or are you trying to prevent really long response times? We're not worried about the average. We just want to make sure we're always there before 8 minutes. Is very different from we want to be there in, you know, we want to be there at, you know, you want to cut. So cutting off really bad outcomes is different from we want to get the fastest average, and we'll get some bad outcomes, really bad ones, but you know, they'll average out. Very different approaches. And it has a huge, you know, like, and you think about NFPA 1710 is the kind of, you know, for a long time, it's kind of actually it grew directly out of these RAND studies. It is, you know, over the years, it has been a lot of things have gotten a lot better on these fronts. But these are these sort of often limited, you know, limited measurement systems for how response time works and how it all works. I think one of the things, Leonard, we talked about this the other day, in response times, a lot of times there's different pieces of it. And of course, dispatch time is a big part of it. How long does it take for a call to come in from 911 to the fire companies actually being told by a dispatcher, leave now, go here? You know, that's an amount of time that it's important. In some cases, you've seen you see cases where cities have stopped counting. There's like 0 dispatch time. They put all that dispatch time onto response time. And so statistically speaking, it looks like suddenly dispatchers are, you know, infinitely faster, and, you know, the fire companies themselves are slower. The statistics make it appear that way, but nothing may have actually changed on the ground. It's just a question of how you are counting the data, the datum, the thing given. and all these variables are, they're really tough to balance out. And how do you, when you're making decisions on these sorts of things? And they have huge impacts. You think about something like dollars and cents. Right now with the pandemic, it's a good time to sort of think about this concept. On a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis, cities have not really been incentivized to have, say, a lot of extra medical supplies on hand, to have constantly updated plans for what do we do with a surge in hospital visits, right? For 20 years, that spending the money on that infrastructure has not been useful for a lot of cities. They haven't gotten a lot of return on those dollars. And as a result, a lot of places cut funding for things they're not getting return on dollars for. Suddenly we're in a situation where a city that did plan for that stuff is light years ahead of every other city in the country and in the world. And there's huge advantages to that. Cities that are able to, they can keep more people alive. They're going to be able to reopen faster. They're going to be able to get their tax revenue base restarted again much more quickly. And so you think about something like spending some small amount of money every year on medical emergency planning for a city, things like that. For 20 years, you got no investment, you got no return on investment from a investment like that in many cases. Suddenly there is enormous return on investment. How do you balance that? What you're spending your dollars on in that situation. It's a little bit like insurance. I don't think I've had reason to use my car insurance, fortunately, for like 5 years or something like that. But I spend the money every year. I don't get any return on investment for it, but I do it because I'm required to, and because there might be a day, sadly, probably, where my car insurance will be really important because I've smashed up my truck or something like that. So that's, an investment that for years paid no dividend, and all of a sudden has paid out, maybe 50 times or 20 times or whatever it is, the amount of money I put into it in that year. These sorts of things are very hard to plan for, and emergency services is a really difficult area to do it in. And I think that's a really interesting thing during a time period like this, and I think just very quickly, something like diversification you can't put a number on. The FDNY was one of the first cities to really integrate EMT and fire service. Really controversial. A lot of firefighters didn't want, the ambulance service on there. Now that it's one of the biggest value adds that the fire department in New York and around the country that fire departments bring to communities is they are the first people on the scene a lot of times for medical emergencies and things like that. Hugely important right now. We are seeing firefighters do a million things that have very little to do with firefighting, particularly during a time period right now. Baltimore is an interesting city, huge high blood pressure problems in Baltimore. The fire department in Baltimore came up with the idea of, we are going to keep our garage doors open when the weather allows, and we're going to set up free blood pressure screening machines in these fire departments. Totally random. What does a fire department have to do with blood pressure? Who knows? But every community has a fire department and a fire company, and people come in to get their blood pressure checked. And it was hugely valuable in between the community, and it was like great for public health, great for the community, and meant that a lot of normal folks, a lot of voters said, "Oh, I love my fire department. My mom got her blood pressure checked there. Like, I'll vote for the, I don't like cutting the fire department budget. I'm going to support them at the ballot box and in the polls and things like that." There's so many different things that go into something like this that are not statistically measured, that are so important to really complex service providers, particularly in the government space. And this idea of using metrics to sort of fully measure these things, it's very difficult, and it can lead to sort of a lot of false analysis as you go through. That's not to say that we shouldn't be using statistics. Of course we should be, right? It's hugely powerful and influential and effective in many ways. But, I think this idea that you need to balance out different approaches and different perspectives and different sort of, methods of inquiry is a way that we think about as kind of a key sort of takeaway from the book and from things like that. But I've gone on for quite a long time. Leonard, I don't know if anyone has got some questions or.
Anyone's free to chime in. It's down to be one of y'all.
monopolize the
Okay,
word so
Leonard.
much.
This is Robert Isbell. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I think this is just unique to our demographics in Round Rock, but we see a disparate relation between fire growth and response times, specifically when response times are under 9 to 10 minutes in some of the areas that have grown kind of out in these little clusters away from the core of the city. And our first arriving units are having a lot more impact. So we've got a fairly young city, demographics, it's affluent, well-educated. It may not match up anywhere else, but it's hard for us to follow a 1710 model when our outcomes are just dramatically different than the response times. And we're finding ourselves, or at least I'm finding myself beating my head on the wall when I've got people telling me we need more fire stations because our response times suck. But conversely, our outcomes are fantastic. Cardiac survival rates are, one of the highest in the state. Our fire losses are one of the lowest. So yeah, we're just struggling with that.
Sounds right to me. I mean, I think, when you're talking about like something like 1710 and national standards, the great appeal of statistics is that they apply across the board, at least in theory, and that you can use one algorithm that will apply for, every fire department in the country. But of course, one size fits all is sometimes it works, but as you said, I mean, if you're talking about a young, affluent population, yeah, you're right. I mean, like exactly, cardiac events are not nearly as big a concern in that area as they might be somewhere else. The nature of the housing stock is a huge factor. If you have, like I said, I'm a volunteer firefighter in a really rural area, and we get structural fires. We don't put them out. It just doesn't happen. I mean, occasionally, but like it almost never happens because you're talking about small buildings, usually trailers, single wides and things like that. They burn fast. And because it's so spread out, it takes a while to get to fires. it was about a 35-mile drive to a fire the other day. That takes a long time to get there. So, structural fires, it's basically, let's hope everybody got out and let's hope they had insurance. We just don't put them out. There's just nothing you can do by the time you get there. That's enormously different for standards for a dense urban city or maybe a sort of more ex-urban suburban. And the demographics and affluence and all these things are huge variables. And it's I wish I had like sort of a cure-all for advice on how to deal with that. But you're right, it's very difficult to take a national standard and apply it out to communities that have totally different standards and situations on the ground. And is a real shortcoming, a lot of these things. And it's tough to abide by rules that were maybe written for different circumstances.
So, and then Leonard, you may speak to the outcome-based measures versus just the metrics. Is there any talk in that with CPSE today?
CPSE's on the line, so I'll let them answer for themselves. I believe they're still on. Actually, they dropped, but pretty much there's more of a focus shifting to the outcome measures rather than just response times. That's been the trend for the last couple of years now. It's like, all right, you get there fast, but if you can't actually put out the fire, what's the point? Or if you can bring out good outcomes. And I think that's it's also like travel time, getting there on scene, but that doesn't mean you're actually, let's say it's a EMS call in an apartment building, we're not tracking getting to the patient a lot of the times, just getting the truck to stop.
Yeah, and that's an outcome. It's a great example of like it's really hard to balance outcome-based versus sort of like more like process, response time-based approaches. And that's not to say that like outcome-based measurements of things are always work either. They're notoriously flawed in a lot of ways. You think about somewhat baseball, earned run average, for anybody who follows baseball, like how many runs a pitcher gives up per 9 innings. It seemed like it's measuring it's an outcome. How many runs did the other team actually score? Seems like a good measure, right? Measure the actual outcome. How good was the pitcher? Problem is that data is involved with there's so many variables that are out of the pitcher's hands. Some of it's just pure luck. Some of it's how good the defense behind them is. There's all these sort of variables that are involved where now, a lot of teams, they only worry about strikeouts and walk and home run rates. They don't worry about earned run average because they say, oh, that data's too noisy. It's too random. There's too many other variables. And they're right about that. And so I think it's really hard to find the right way to do this, but I think, the idea that you're going to find a perfect model, a perfect algorithm or measurement system is really difficult. And I think that the idea of the very difficult, the hard, but I think necessary thing of balancing different variables and measurement systems and all these different things is really where I think is the best place for planners to be, is sort of think about things on multiple levels and in different ways. Yeah.
We have one question from Daniel June asking what's the rest of the story of the closing of fire departments. When did they close and did they ever come back? And pretty much how did the Bronx bounce back?
Yeah, so I mean, the fire companies themselves, most of them were not reopened. A couple here and there, but by and large, it was on the order of 25, 30 companies that were closed. The vast majority of them were in these poor, dense neighborhoods. In the city, huge, disastrous impact of, whole neighborhoods being burned down. Initially there was no need to reopen these departments, these companies, because there was no one living in the neighborhoods. You just had empty, abandoned neighborhoods where you didn't really have any activity. You didn't really need fire companies. Since then, the Bronx has recovered significantly for a number of reasons. A lot of that's good planning. One thing was this sort of centralized top-down approach. New York City under Ed Koch actually sort of rejected some of that, particularly from an urban planning standpoint. Instead of taking massive federal money to redevelop huge swaths of the city and build all these sort of centrally planned government buildings and housing and stuff like that, the New York City instead really incentivized local community groups to rebuild. They said, who knows better what this neighborhood needs, what kind of housing it needs, what kind of services it needs, and the people who live there. And so they funded a lot of community groups. Another variable they didn't take into account was immigration. One of the biggest things driving real estate costs in New York City is not just gentrification, wealthy people moving back to the city, but just the sheer numbers of people. 10,000 yuppies fresh out of college, and there are 100,000 of them in New York City matters, but millions upon millions of immigrants matters much more. The Bronx has always been a deeply immigrant neighborhood, and so they had a huge influx in the neighborhood I used to live in, the South Bronx, of Southern Mexican folks moving in, Oaxacan, people really kind of like NAFTA natives. So one guy referred to himself and his family, families that were really impacted by farming, subsistence farming families that were really impacted by NAFTA things in the 1990s, who moved to New York City. And so that really drove a lot of the rebirth. Nowadays in New York City, they're constantly in fights over response times and things like that. I'm not as up to date on the recent trends in those areas. But the city, it really bounced back. A lot of lessons were learned from this era. A lot more initiative and emphasis put on local communities. There was a big, sort of resurgence in the value of government services in these neighborhoods, that realization. And the comeback is pretty remarkable in a lot of ways. I mean, these neighborhoods that look completely burned out now have population numbers like they did back in the 1950s and 60s before the burnout. So New York was lucky in that regard that it was able to recover. But there was a period of time where New York really was doing everything it could to sort of sabotage itself, and was lucky and fortunate to learn from those mistakes and recover from them.
Yeah, thank you.
Anyone else? And if
this is Matt. I just wanted to say this is fantastic and really captures some of the same conversations that are going on these days too. And unfortunately, we haven't moved. In many cases, haven't moved beyond them. But I think we're a bit more thoughtful and a bit more nuanced in our approach. And And going back to the question about from Round Rock, like now we have analysts who can actually, who can ask more nuanced questions and develop more nuanced analyses to be able to support. As they say with statistics, you can always kind of, is that book How to Lie with Statistics, and so or How to Lie with Maps, and so you can always articulate a justification. So you just have to be, there's an ethical issue, ethical nuance to it as well.
Yeah, I think sometimes with the word sophomore, which as my understanding of the root of it, it means wise fool. It is the person who is smart enough to think they know everything, but not smart enough to know how little they really know. Right. And I think like you probably get that with statistical planning, like the initial wave of things, people get really arrogant. I've got it figured out. Engineering mindsets are very, sort of 0-1, right? Binary, figured it out or didn't. And as these industries and these modeling systems and planning systems improve, people start to realize how little they really do know. And they get better at balancing out different variables and looking at different ways of approaching it. Like you said, you can look at response times, you can look at outcome-based measures, you can look at a lot of different things. And I think that that's frustrating because it means there are no easy answers, right? There is no single, oh, here's the equation, here's the thing. But that's just life. I think it's a little naive to think that there are easy answers to much of anything in the world. And I think that like realizing that the complexities and shortcomings and the values of, mathematical modeling is just a part of that maturation process, going from being, thinking we know everything to realizing, well, we know a little more than before, but we still got a lot to learn and a lot of things to take into account.
All right, I guess that's it. This right student group, if you all don't mind hanging on for at least 5 minutes so we can just discuss how we move forward, maybe meet tomorrow. Thank you, Joe. And I'll be posting the recording on probably a Google Drive and distribute it across my mailing list.
Leonard, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for tuning in. I said, check out the book. You can find it online wherever books are sold, and I'm pretty easy to get a hold of if anyone ever wants to chat more directly or specifically about any of this stuff. And one last thought I'm going to leave on a quote from Michael Lewis, a guy who wrote Moneyball, who had this great line. I was interviewing him for The Big Short, his book about the financial crisis, and he said, there's this interesting period where when statistics are first used, they're another way to think hard about complicated problems. And that's a good thing. The problem that occurs is when the statistics become an excuse for not thinking hard about complicated problems, for saying, no, model says this, we're good, let's not worry about it. And I think that's really the moment where you get into trouble in these sorts of things, is when you stop using these things to think hard about things that are difficult and complex, and when you start just using it as a handicap and saying like, well, just look at this thing, that's it, and that's it, won't worry about it. We won't have to think hard. Then the stats will do the work for us. The algorithms do the work for us. That's where you really get in that danger zone. But yeah, thanks, Leonard. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody, and enjoy the rest of your days and what I'm sure are really difficult times and a crisis. And I just want to say thank you to all of you, particularly those who are working in government services and firefighting in the front lines of, in this time where who would have thought how important firefighters would be in this completely non-firefighting sort of period of time. But I think it's pretty obvious. And a quick thank you from a nerd who's behind the computer typing and crunching numbers all the time. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Leonard. I'm out.
Thank you all for joining.
Thanks.